Thank you, everybody, for participating today in the Insolvency Practice Group meeting for TerraLex. We have good content for you here today. We've assembled a panel to talk about the food supply chain in the United States. We have 4 distinguished panelists. I'll add myself to that list. I am Mark Benedict. I'm one of the chairs of the North American Insolvency Practice Group, and I'll be moderating our panel discussion today. Let me do a few introductions of our panel before we get started on the substance of our discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Mr. David Smith. David is the CEO of Associated Wholesale Grocers, Inc., headquartered in Kansas City, Kansas. David has been in the grocery industry for the better part of his life, and he's been with AWG for the last 17 years. He's currently the CEO, but he has done wonderful things for AWG during his entire tenure, including starting the Pearl River division of AWG from scratch and building a warehouse business for AWG in Louisiana from the ground up. David will be helping us here today, giving us an insider perspective from the industry, and we're very, very grateful for David to join us. To David's right is Brian Darer. Brian joins us from the Parker Poe firm, which is the North Carolina TerraLex member. I believe, Brian, you're officed in Raleigh, North Carolina. Brian is a partner in the Insolvency Practice Group of Parker Poe. He's been practicing for a little over 20 years with great experience, particularly creditor side, and he's recently been involved in the largest sweet potato bankruptcy in the United States and has gained some insight in the food sector through that representation, among others. Our last but not least panelist is Bob Faucher from Holland and Hart. Holland and Hart is one of the Western states representatives. You have multiple states, Bob. I am aware of Colorado, Wyoming, I believe Nevada and Idaho. Did I miss any, Bob, for Holland and Hart in TerraLex?
I think that's right, Mark. Thanks.
Bob brings over 30 years of experience in the insolvency area to the table. Bob represents clients across the spectrum, but for purposes of this panel, he has dairy industry experience representing cheese manufacturers and brings some insight from that level of the supply chain. And as I indicated, I'm Mark Benedict with the Husch Blackwell law firm. We are the Missouri representative, and in addition to doing grocery work primarily with David, I have been representing clients in the protein space, which is just a fancy way of saying meat packing companies and cattle farmers and hog farmers. But with that, I'd like to turn over first to David to help set the stage to give us a industry insider's view of the current status of the food supply chain and what he's seeing inside the grocery industry. David?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark, and flattered to be with you guys today. A little bit about the industry as a whole. Obviously, there's really been 2 years, year to date, in 2020, and we have pre-COVID and post-COVID. And so on the next slide that you're looking at here is a correlation that started on really just following the initial stock-up phase. What we wanted to do was to kind of understand the baseline of the sales. Effective March 11th, really when the president announced that we were going into some shelter-in-place orders nationally, consumers rushed to the supermarkets, and we saw increases in sales that went above 140% of the prior year. So we separated out everything prior to March the 20th in order to take out of that incredible peaks and valleys, in order to understand a little bit about where the new business was coming from. And there's a direct correlation between what happened with food away from home, which is what would be the traditional restaurant business, but would also be in schools, institutions, and other sources that's away from home. And the line on the bottom of the chart that you see is the week by week and day by day sales trend with that group, varying as low as a minus 68% and beginning to come back a little bit, as you can see later on in May, coming back to in the mid 40% decline range. The top line is the corresponding line for the food at home, which is primarily the supermarkets and food being sold in C-stores and in clubs. And as you can see, they line up very well. The increase that we're seeing within the supermarket channel directly corresponds to the declines in the restaurant business. And so we begin to see this photograph of what ended up happening with the change in the consumer behavior. On this next slide, we get a little more granular to understand how these food expenditures work. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see comparing the food away from home and food away from home as far as in the correlation of those declines. We start with a 3% of the food expenditures, which is at a 10% decline, and going up as high as 100%. So what this means is that if we took away all of the food away from home, it would correlate with a 31% increase at food at home. Where we're at today is somewhere in that middle, within that green block. 50 to 60% of the food away from home is now being translated into that 15 to 18% sales lift at food at home. Well, so why isn't it dollar for dollar? Well, the supermarket business operates on a very low margin and they have a very efficient supply chain. The restaurant business, the actual cost of the product is only about a third of what you pay at the restaurant. So it does not translate dollar for dollar. Also, within this same year, we're also seeing changes in consumer behavior related to insecurity, financial insecurity. So as we look to the upper right-hand corner, and on this chart, this is another way to look at it. The business of food away from home, as I defined earlier, has declined or will decline for fiscal 2020. We're projecting about a 46% decrease, or $405 billion. That correlates to an increase in the food at home of about $110 billion. So that's what's coming out in the numbers. So you see the shift away from food service and prepared food offerings to being prepared at home, more of a DIY restaurant business. And on the bottom right-hand corner, it breaks it down into the categories for the food at home expenditures by type in the increases. As you can see, the largest number or the largest amount of those dollars is going into the supermarkets or the grocery stores, increasing from $458.7 billion up to $534.3 billion, with a somewhat lesser amount going into clubs and even less than that going into mail order, home delivery, and direct sales. And on this slide, we're looking at the food away from home decline and the impact on food at home. And we're breaking down the rest of 2020 and we're rolling into 2021. While we don't know exactly what will happen with the COVID-19 crisis, we must project to the best of our ability how it will affect our business, right? So the second quarter of 2020, which we're in today, we're projecting that our industry will be up about 20% in total. The third quarter of 2020, about 17%, the fourth quarter, about 11%, rolling into the first quarter of 2021 at 6%. Now, if there is a tremendous number of other variables, and it isn't only the shelter in place and the concern about going in the physical store or going in the physical restaurant, we have the downturn of the economy, and which is a huge factor. And so when we look back at the past three really major recessions that we've had, there's an 84% inverse correlation with the change in employment rate, the percentage, into the percentage of decline in the food away from home business. In other words, if there is a 1% increase in the unemployment rate, there is an 84-point decline in the percentage of business that the food away from home retail establishments have. And on this slide, we show what you already know, which is this, if you're going back for the last 20 years, all the way back to May of 2000 through to current, we have never seen the unemployment rates that we're dealing with today. We're nearing 40 million Americans that are unemployed in the civilian unemployment rate. And when you're talking about those numbers, many of the people that are the hardest hit is the lower income. 40% of all consumers that make less than $40,000 a year are now unemployed. And so that changes the buying habits and changes the buying habits away from food away from home, which is generally seen as being more expensive. And so it will continue to change their behavior. And there's many facets to what we're seeing as far as within the stores. Obviously, we know that e-commerce has gone up tremendously, but the trips decline has begun to slow here later on in the COVID-19 crisis. The center store purchases, which went crazy for really the key staples in the beginning, now are becoming a little bit more indulgent as people are been in their homes for much, much longer. The shopping frequency level declined sharply, and our customer count declined sharply going into the stores, where they were leveraging more on e-commerce. But now people are beginning to go back in the store, and they're beginning to buy less as far as their total order size and buy more frequently. Also, the drug and dollar channels are now beginning to bring in more new shoppers, where they were shying away from those early on in the pandemic. Also, as we look at within that, e-commerce online sales has increased about 60% since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, which has been about a 21% increase in the people that were leveraging online for their purchases. They've declined their number of trips to the supermarket by about 5%. The basket size has now exceeded over $124 in total for online purchases, increase of about 10%. Home delivery is up 53%, and click and collect is up 91%. The brick and mortar stores are, as far as in their penetration, it has changed week over week. So as you look toward the bottom, you will see that on the far right hand corner, you'll see that there was changes as far as the frequency of times going to those outlets. And now you're seeing that beginning to decline and moderate, where the basket sizes continue to increase. The picture here is that consumer behavior and the traffic that's going within all of the supply chain has changed. And each one of the companies that are within the supply chain, the providers, the shippers, the growers, the farmers, and the people that are in every segment of it have had to adjust their businesses for huge increases on one side and huge declines on others. Therein lies both an opportunity and a challenge for many. And those that are best prepared to be able to take on these new changes and the changes in customer behavior and the new changes that come with this high unemployment rate and the deep recessionary pattern that we're going into, those will be the companies that succeed the most, and the ones that are unable to make those changes or unwilling to will be the ones with the greatest challenges.
David,
Turn it over to you, Mark.
Thank you, David. Based on what you're seeing at the grocery supply level, what are the food-related businesses that you see that are at the greatest risk of an insolvency event or really, a financial restructuring?
People that their pure line business would have been with independent small restaurants and bars are the ones that will be hit the first and hit the hardest. Approximately 14% of all restaurants have now closed permanently. And when you start talking about small independent bars and businesses, restaurants that were very dependent on the dine-in consumer, they are far and away the most vulnerable. And those companies that were suppliers to those businesses are also the most vulnerable. Quick serve restaurants, businesses that have a drive-through window, have a well built out capacity to be able to deliver at home and to be able to have curbside type businesses where it's takeaway. Those will respond very quickly, and many of them are actually up over their prior levels. And the companies that are heavily balanced toward those will rebound very well. But those companies that are very reliant on that on-premise experience type business in dining rooms are the most vulnerable, both on the supply side and on the retail side, Mark.
Well, I want to talk about the supply side for just a moment. And you know, from my experience when looking at the producer side, only about half, it depends by the industry, some it's 48%, some it's 51%, but rough numbers, half of food production goes into the food away from home side of the supply chain, not the grocery retail side of the supply chain. And so if you're saying that the producers are the ones that are at the financial risk if they're doing their work with the weak players in the food away from home business, don't we have a potential ripple effect up the supply chain if rough numbers, 50% of a given commodity are directed through that part of the food supply chain?
It certainly is a vulnerability. So if you think about, so if they're in the beef business, and the more expensive cuts of beef are being sold and the highest grades of beef are being sold through the high-end restaurants. And the high-end restaurants are more about the experience and the on-premise consumption. Their markups, their margins, both for the supplier and the producer, are much higher. When they have to move their production and they have to move that over and sell it as a commodity that would be sold through supermarkets, you're not only dealing with the lost business, you're dealing with whatever you're doing with your herd and with your production side. You're dealing with something that's going to be more of a commodity at a much lower price. And so not everybody can adjust to that. And before, they were perhaps selling their high-end steaks to restaurants and maybe some of the end meats they had that also went into some other things, and they balanced it out in a very profitable way. But the value to the producer themselves, the farmer, and the value to the companies that actually went through and processed it to whichever levels they went to, both of them are going to be dealing with margin compression. And what we've dealt with for the past few weeks is nothing compared to what it will look like whenever we start to come out of this. To give you, for instance, when you're talking about the ripple effect, whenever we first had the downturn for the restaurant business, which really started somewhere around the 15th of March. I mean, it pretty much shuttered many of the dine-in restaurants. It backed up the everything in the wholesale supply. So the food service suppliers were calling us and calling our stores, trying to vent off all of this excess they had, both in meat and produce, dairy products, and we took that product in order to move it through the supply chain. Some 3 weeks ago, as they started to reopen the economy, those same food service suppliers started taking a lot of product out of the supply chain. We know that there's already a shortage on the production side for beef, pork, and to a lesser extent with poultry. And so they were competing for that same product. But what happened was a lot of the demand wasn't there. So while they pulled it out of the supply pipeline and brought it into facilities, it was only a few days before they went back and were calling on us to take some of the surplus, because the sales did not rebound in all areas in the same way. Different areas and different groups of consumers are behaving totally different as far as how quickly they're willing to go back in to restaurants, even with the social distancing, even with those constraints in place. People are behaving differently because they feel safer in some areas than they do in others. And so it has been very interesting, and there's been a lot of peaks and valleys in that supply chain. But you're exactly right, Mark.
Hey, Mark,
Well, Bob,
can I ask a question, David? So, David, in your experience, the suppliers and the producers, are they diversified sufficiently, or are there groups that are really just restaurants, food away from home, that they're just not going to be able to rebound from this?
It varies. Whether you're talking about the wholesale supplier type company, and you're talking about the producer themselves. they vary a lot. Some of them were very balanced companies. You look at, say, for instance, Tyson. While Tyson supplied a lot to the supermarket group, they also supplied a lot to the restaurant business. They're able to pivot a lot easier. They weren't trying to appeal to just a niche market where they were buying truly high-end cattle that was very, very unique. They weren't only handling Wagyu beef, for instance, or something that was very, very expensive that probably there's going to be very little sales through as a commodity through the supermarket. And so while they were hurt because of the decline, that when you looked at where both of those two businesses were on that original line chart, and you saw the sales, when it went down in the food away from home, it went up correspondingly in the supermarket. They were on both sides of that. There are some companies, though, exactly as you described, Ryan, that they were very heavily balanced into that food away from home. And it gets even worse when that food away from home, they were mostly within those dine-in type higher end restaurants and bars that are going to be the most affected. And so you have to look at each of those businesses individually and think about their portfolio of their customer base. And each one of them, the ones that now try to adjust, it'll be near impossible for them to do it, because those that are in a high touch, high service, high end with very unique and bespoke products that are going to the restaurant, there may not be a market for that in the mainline supermarket. And you can't just decide tomorrow that you're going to start selling to someone different, because you have the markups, you have the cost, you have all of those processes. And I know in talking when we had our first call with the president, and we were talking about the supply chain, and it was surprising to them that the restaurants used produce and we used produce, but very little of the produce was the same produce. It's not packaged in a way that's ready for retail sale, for instance, in the supermarket. It's just in a bulk package that goes to the restaurant, and we need it to be in individual packages that are ready to go to the home. So that refitting is something that many of them may not be able or willing to refit in order to be able to do that. So there isn't a one size fits all as far as that vulnerability. It applies to all, but the ones that are at the greatest risk are those that really fit into that niche.
Well, Bob, you've done work with dairy and cheese manufacturers. There's been anecdotal information that's hit the news and news outlets and newspapers about dairy farmers dumping gallons of milk because there's no outlet for their product. What are you seeing in the cheese supply chain at the producer level, and what vulnerabilities are you seeing at that level with that type of client base?
Well, thanks, Mark. It's very interesting listening to David, because many of the points that he makes with respect to his experience are the same things we're seeing in the dairy industry. I mean, as David suggested, it's a major shift from the away from home market to the at home market. And as David suggested in other contexts, I mean, some businesses are more able to do that than other businesses. One fascinating thing about dairy, though, Mark, as you know, is that it's whereas David was talking about changes in supply, that's very hard to do in dairy, because you have an ag product that's harvested 2 to 3 times a day. I mean, the cows are milked 2 to 3 times a day. You have to milk them. The cows are there, so you have this product, and it's almost impossible to do things like, obviously with potatoes, you can put those in storage. Petroleum products, you can put those in storage. Meat, you can hold cattle back from slaughter, but with dairy, the milk is there every day, and it has to go somewhere every day. And so as this change from the away from home market to the at home market occurred in the dairy industry, again, following up on things David said, the question is refitting. I mean, how easy is it for some producers and some dairymen to shift from one market to the other? And it isn't that easy. I mean, some can do it better than others. And so the milk dumping phenomenon that we've seen, and luckily there hasn't been that much in Idaho, but there is nationwide, you know, it's exactly this problem where, you know, the supply keeps coming. And so if there's a disconnect between supply and demand, and a disconnect between moving from the away from home market to the at home market, well, that's going to mean that there's milk left on the ground somewhere. And so unfortunately, that's what we've seen. And another interesting point following up what David said, I mean, David talked about how that's given rise to, in other markets, to supply and demand disruptions. Again, the quantity of milk is kind of fixed. So in addition to seeing milk being dumped, Mark, what we've ended up seeing is incredible price volatility. After many flat years in dairy, the prices were getting up to the point that the dairy farmers liked at the beginning of the year. But again, following up on what David said, we've had a pre-COVID and post-COVID 2020. So where prices were decent at the beginning of the year, in April, they actually plunged 30 to 40% across various cheese prices, various class of milk prices. So the price went way down, and however now it started to rise back up again. And in fact, whereas it was as low as it had been in a long time in mid-April, we're now seeing highs that are quite high in a historic level. And part of that, again, because the cheese and the milk keep coming by and large, the way that's become reconciled in dairy, at least, Mark, is by the government stepping in. I saw some numbers that in the last 30 days, the US government has purchased 5% of all dairy products in the country. So you have the Farmers to Food Box program offered by the USDA. Also, tremendous financial support from the USDA directly to farmers in the Corona Food Assistance Program. Section 32 program under USDA, and then also the SBA's Paycheck Protection Program. Obviously, that's not something limited to dairy. So, you know, that's what I'm seeing in dairy. There has been an effect on supply, and that I know in where I live, Idaho at least, there you know, as a result of the tremendous shock to the system in April, there were a few dairies that went out of business just kind of overnight. Their bank refused to advance any more funds, and they've had herd dispersal auctions. So that's something we've seen here. Mark, that might be a longer answer than you wanted in response to your question. But again, I think it's interesting that dairy provides a great example of many of the themes that David articulated in his opening talk.
Well, I want to build a little bit on a couple things that you said, Bob, because I've been representing clients in the protein space, meat packers. For those listening into the conversation, Kansas processes roughly 22% of all beef that is processed and packed in the United States, and the Heartland is 30 to 40% of all pork processing, and you also have major poultry processing here in the Midwest. And with COVID, the outbreaks in the Midwest seem to have been centered on the meatpacking plants, which has caused many of the producers to shut their facilities, which created choke points in the supply chain. So farmers would have hogs or cattle finished and ready to go to slaughter, and no place to sell them. And so that has created a collapse in the market price of these various commodities. I pulled up just two very quick government statistics, and I'll ask Nicole to pull up the first slide. As with any agricultural product, when you're dealing with live animals, you have to start with the live offspring, because in a farming operation, you have farming operators that start the animals who have a birthing operation. And then, of course, you have the finishers who take the animals and get them to market weight, and then they go to slaughter. The slide that I've asked Nicole to pull up is a squiggly spaghetti salad, if you will, of market prices. But the lowest line you see there at the bottom represents the wiener pig price. That is the price of a piglet that's been weaned from its mother that can be sold to a farmer who's going to raise it for slaughter. That price has absolutely collapsed. It was near zero at the beginning, near the end of April and beginning of May, and still is not over $10 a piglet. As a result, the cost to feed the animals, to birth them and get them started and get them into the supply chain, really, at the starting point, has become uneconomical for a lot of farmers. And this corresponds with what we see as the packing plants and the prices at the packing plants, which again, I pulled a slide from the USDA from just Tuesday. Nicole, if you'll move to the next slide. And what this tracks on the left-hand side is the price per carcass, the average price per carcass at the meatpacking plants for a hog. And you'll see that initially there was a demand as the people started rushing to the grocery store to stockpile, and before COVID hit the packing plants. But when the packing plants started closing, the fatted hog market dropped and has been averaging plus or minus $2 to $3, around $30 a carcass. And so if there's no market for your weanling pigs because the farmers can't raise the piglets to sell them at market, what do they have to do? They have to reduce their herds, because otherwise the pigs will continue to breed and the piglets will get in the marketplace. There'll be no place to sell them. There'll be no market for them. And so my last chart is the sow slaughter. At any given time, a herd will be aging out, and so there'll always be a certain level of sows that are being sent to the slaughterhouse to be slaughtered. But when it's not economical to continue to feed the sows to birth piglets because there's no market for your piglets, you start slaughtering your sows at a greater level than you did before. And the red line represents what's happening in 2020, and farmers are reducing the size of herds. And the ones that can't take their sows to slaughter are euthanizing their animals, which is going to create a smaller overall herd size in the United States, which unfortunately is going to cause a scarcity at some point in the future, which is going to ultimately drive up prices again, which good for farmers because they can get a higher price for their market, at market for their animals, but it's not good in the short term because it may create shortages and make it uneconomical for people losing their jobs to be able to buy the meat products. And Nicole, you can drop the slides now. And so, you're seeing these chokes in supply chain and farmers having issues really at the producer level. And that's creating potential farmer bankruptcies. And so when you've got the producers not able to sell their outlets, we are, I think, going to see a number of new bankruptcy filings really at the farmer level. Now, Brian's been involved in some farm bankruptcies over the last couple of years, particularly on the produce side. Farm bankruptcies are a bit unique under U.S. bankruptcy law. There is a special part of the bankruptcy law for a farmer to file what we refer to as a Chapter 12 reorganization, which is specialized to family farmers with debts under a certain dollar amount. And over the last year, those limits have gone up so more farmers can qualify. But there's also some special remedies that Brian has been involved in related to perishable agricultural commodities. Brian, would you explain to our, particularly to our foreign lawyers, what perishable agricultural commodity is and why that may make a difference if there's a producer bankruptcy?
Sure, absolutely, Mark. Thank you so much. To kind of follow up a little bit, the produce industry is a little bit different than, for example, the dairy industry, just in the variety of what's involved. You have got essentially the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act, which is PACA. It covers basically any kind of fruits and vegetables. That's an oversimplification of it, but you've got perishable agricultural commodities, and they vary. You have got farmers who sell things that have very short shelf lives, that have to get into stores quickly, get to restaurants quickly, and spoil quickly. You've got also farmers who have things that last a very long time, and Bob had mentioned, potatoes, for example, can sit for quite a while before they go out to the end user. So it kind of covers the whole variety. And in the farming industry specifically, you're going to have small family farmers who might have a very small crop. They might supply only to restaurants. They might supply only to grocery stores or things like that. And then you're going to have very big, very large farmers. What Congress realized, and this is back in 1930, they passed the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act. The purpose of that was to promote fair business practices and resolve disputes. And ultimately, what Congress had determined was when farmers are not paid for their produce, that is a burden on commerce. And for that, they've set up some special rules in order for farmers, and not just farmers, but for any seller, to get paid for their produce. So the first thing, and Mark, as you said, kind of for our foreign folks that might be listening in on this, PACA applies to all sellers of produce, whether you're domestic or whether you're foreign, whether you're licensed or not licensed, whether you're an importer, exporter. It's going to apply to everyone. Now, there are some nuances in terms of when you have to be licensed. I'm not going to get into all the details of licensing, and you may get excluded on certain things. But generally speaking, I think it's safe to assume that anyone who sells produce ultimately can get the benefit of PACA. And what PACA ultimately holds is that the proceeds from the sale of that produce is held in trust for the seller. So, for example, if a farmer were to sell to a distributor and that distributor does not pay that farmer, but then the distributor sells the produce to an end user, supermarket, to restaurant, wherever it's going, the proceeds that distributor receives is held in trust for the seller of that produce, and that if that seller is not paid, there is personal liability for the owner who hasn't paid the seller, and that trust it supersedes almost any other creditor. So if there's a secured creditor that has a lien on accounts and cash, the law is that that cash is held in trust for the seller, and therefore the seller would have a higher priority to it than the secured lender, who otherwise would have a lien on those proceeds. The other benefit to PACA, and we'll kind of get into some details on it, but one of the benefits is that there is a conflict resolution process. So a seller who doesn't get paid can file an informal complaint with USDA. There's a process set up under that. And then if you don't get paid after the informal process, you can file a formal complaint with USDA. You can also file a lawsuit in court, and then and ultimately try to get the proceeds. And it is common, very common in these lawsuits, that the very first thing that happens is essentially an injunction enjoining the defendant from spending any of the money that they might have gotten from the sale of that produce. And the other important thing is that trust extends not just to the cash, but to anything that the buyer used with that cash or to buy with that cash. So there's law out there that if you use those proceeds to pay real estate taxes, to pay utilities on a building, that trust can extend to some or all of the real estate. It will extend to equipment. If you use the proceeds to buy equipment rather than pay the seller, then that trust would also extend to the equipment. Now, when that buyer goes into bankruptcy, you now have all these rights in bankruptcy ahead of a secured creditor. There is a complicated, or not really complicated, but a very specific process and procedure that needs to be followed if you want to take advantage of the PACA, of the benefits of PACA. The first thing is that PACA requires that there be, quote, prompt payment terms. And by prompt payment terms, that means no more than 30 days. So any seller who gives a buyer more than 30 days to make a payment automatically is outside of the protections of PACA. So you automatically lose any PACA protection if you have payment terms exceeding 30 days. If you have a written agreement, again, it has to be no more than 30 days, and it could be anything less than that. PACA also has certain default provisions on payment terms if there's not a written agreement. It could vary on a lot of different circumstances. Generally speaking, it's going to be 10 days for a traditional seller, but importers, exporters, there might be some different default rules on it. And that's also important to know, because when a buyer does not make a payment to the seller is required to provide a notice to the buyer of an intent to preserve their PACA rights. And that notice must be provided within 30 days of the payment deadline. So if you have payment terms of 30 days, which would be allowed under PACA, the 30 days runs and the buyer doesn't make a payment, you now have 30 days from that point to provide your PACA notice. If you miss that deadline, again, you're out of luck, and you fall into an unsecured creditor. The
bankruptcy courts generally amenable to PACA arguments. Do they take it seriously, or do they take the position that the bankruptcy code trumps these rights?
Right. No, I think the PACA, the rights under PACA do apply in a bankruptcy, and the judges. I mean, I think there's no question that your PACA rights apply in bankruptcy. The bigger question is how friendly the judge is to enforcing those PACA rights, and how familiar the judge is with the PACA process. So a court with experience in this process, it would be very common to sort of set up very early on in the case, sometimes even as part of first day motions in a bankruptcy case, a PACA procedures whereby the court sets deadlines for creditors to file they'll call it a PACA proof of claim. It's essentially a proof of claim, but it's your PACA claim, and to attach to that all of the supporting all the supporting documents for that PACA claim. And then often we'll set deadlines for a debtor or a trustee to object to the PACA claim, and a process to work through those PACA objections. I think it's common for that to happen. I guess what's unclear is how friendly the judge might be to interpreting some of those PACA rights. As I mentioned, the PACA requirements are very, very specific. And if you miss any of those deadlines, or if you provide a notice that doesn't have the required language in it, you're out of luck. And those are going to be, common objections that a buyer, either in bankruptcy or outside of bankruptcy, are going to have to objecting to a PACA claim. Secured creditors might also raise those objections, because as I mentioned, the PACA statute gives a seller rights essentially ahead of a secured creditor. So secured creditors often object to PACA claims as well. I will give kind of as an example, Mark, that you had mentioned early on that we were involved in a large sweet potato bankruptcy in North Carolina, and what the debtor was a sweet potato packer and processor. So what that is, for those that are not familiar with that, essentially you had individual sweet potato farmers, hundreds of them, and they would sell their sweet potatoes to the debtor. The debtor would then process and pack them. Some of them would be packaged into the frozen sweet potatoes that get sent to supermarkets. Some are getting packaged into those waffle fries, whatever they might be, bags of potato chips, all these things would get processed. What happened in our case, which is common in the potato processing industry, and this is why I said it's very different than other produce and very different than the dairy and the meat, is those potatoes would be delivered to the processor and they would sit on their shelves in their warehouse for some period of time. And the way that, and what would happen is at some point in the future, that packer would then go to the shelf, pull out a bin of potatoes that belong to farmer A and process them. And it wasn't until it was processed that the buyer or the packer actually accepted the potatoes.
The delivery of the potatoes.
Right. So now PACA requires, so now there are payment terms, and let's assume those are 30-day, there was a written contract for 30-day terms, but those 30-day terms doesn't start until the potatoes are now brought in for packing or processing or whatever they were used for. Then they might have sat on the shelf for 2 weeks. They might have sat on the shelf for 2 months. And the farmer had no way of knowing. And it would be up to the debtor to let the farmer know that we've now taken a bin of your potatoes and we now owe you X amount of money for those potatoes. Of course, the packer doesn't tell the farmer. The packer doesn't pay the farmer. The farmer now has essentially 60 days from when those potatoes got taken off the shelf and packed in order to provide the packing notice, the 30 days for the net 30-day terms plus the 30 days under PACA to provide the notice. We had a situation about, a lot of the farmers were facing objections that they failed to provide timely notice under PACA. And the questions then were, when did they have to provide notice? When was acceptance? And when was payment due? We had a judge, to circle back to your question, Mark, we had a judge very friendly to PACA, but also very debtor friendly. So understood PACA, and had a PACA process that we followed in the bankruptcy court, and every single objection that the debtor filed was sustained by the court. So the farmers lost every single objection, and there were about 15 farmers that there were objections filed for, and they all lost.
It's interesting that you mentioned how potatoes are different at the packer level. With the PACA, Perishable Agricultural Commodity Act, that would apply upstream. So if that packer turned around and then sold those potatoes to, say, a supermarket chain or to a restaurant, the packer that was the middleman would also have the rights to assert PACA claims against the restaurant or the supermarket or the wholesaler that they delivered to. Right. And PACA, I thought, is pretty interesting in the potato area because frozen potatoes and potentially French fries might count, even though they've been processed to a minimal degree, sliced or blanched for freezing. And so it's actually really surprising how expansive the list of products are that qualify for PACA.
Yeah, and I think the practical advice for anyone who was listening would be that if you're dealing with basically any fruit or vegetable, fresh, frozen, a bag of potato chips, whatever it is, assume for right now that PACA applies. Assume it applies before, and don't assume it doesn't apply. And it may not apply depending on the nuances, but you're better off assuming it applies and following that process.
Well, that sounds great. Well, we're almost out of time, but I'd like to end where we started, and I'd like to go back to David and ask, where you see the winners and the losers, because obviously the losers of what's happening right now are most likely the situations that are going to generate work for the bankruptcy lawyers. So I'm interested to hear, and the winners are the most likely place for foreign investment to be interested in bringing new dollars to the table to fuel mergers and acquisitions. So David, if you just take a few minutes here, and kind of bookend the start of your presentation and kind of identify who you think are the winners and the losers so that we as bankruptcy lawyers can start targeting our next round of clients.
Yeah, so food service distributors that their primary business was small, independently owned, full-service dine-in restaurants are the most vulnerable. And there's a lot of them, small regional companies. Even some of the largest food service distributors, they did not do a very good job of having diversity in their portfolio. They primarily were serving one certain group or another group, and those will emerge in a totally different place. This has been very kind to the supermarket business. Both the chains, the publicly traded companies, and the privately traded companies, or the privately owned companies, and even in the independent grocers. This has been very, very, very good for them. And we see really that having about a 18-month tail on it. And even at the end of that tail, whatever position we find the economy in at that point, we expect that there's probably going to be some changes in behavior that will last for a generation. Now, those may be more subtle. Identifying individual companies or where that would be within the producer or the supplier side, it really goes back to what I talked about earlier, which is those companies, those producers that were dealing with very unique, had a one-to-one relationship with another company that's going to be adversely hit. If you're a farmer or a rancher or a producer that provides to one of those businesses that was solely reliant on that type of business, they're going to be vulnerable. But even within the supermarket, there are a lot of winners and losers. People are thinking totally differently about the large salad bars inside of the supermarket. They're bulk foods, which has been a tremendous growth area in past years. There's a big shift that's underway, and some of the really sweetheart businesses within the food sector that have had high growth, as people begin to trade down because of economic conditions, they too will be hurt. A lot of companies that were, because look, we had a very strong economy. We had incredibly low unemployment. We had full employment in many ways, and people were flush with cash. And so as we adjust to this new economic conditions, a lot of those same companies, and so there will be companies that were reliant on people having accessibility. The consumers now are falling into two primary groups. You have insulated and you have constrained. The insulated people, unfortunately, are those that are more like us. These are people that are in more white-collar jobs, that they're continuing to be paid, and that they're insulated from this. And even within that insulated group, there will be some changes. Their business may not be as good. They may have to make some changes because they're concerned about the economic conditions. They may not be quite as aggressive as they would have been. But then you have the other side, and those are people that are constrained, and they're constrained economically, and they're also constrained out of new fears that they didn't have before because of that they may be more vulnerable. And those people that are on that side of the equation, their behaviors going forward are going to be very different. And that will impact our business. And what's happened up to this point, our government has pumped a lot of money into the economy. And we've the amount of money that they've put to double up on unemployment benefits, the 40% increase in SNAP benefits, the direct checks to people that earned below a certain amount. Those all turned into disposable dollars that are continuing to show up in the numbers. We have not seen the bottom. We have seen the impact of the initial COVID-19 outbreak, and we have seen predictions of how it's going to affect us. But until we go into the end of the second quarter and into the third quarter, after July, after the bonus on the unemployment, until we get through those things and there's some new state, we won't see all of it. But the businesses are going to be aplenty. Independent restaurants that were dining in and their suppliers and bars, there's going to be huge casualties because consumers will not be coming back to those. Those companies that are able to pivot, that have a well-established e-commerce and takeaway business in the restaurant sector, will be able to come back. Quick service restaurants will be strong because everyone, as a return to work and even the work from home, they're going to get tired of cooking for themselves and eating macaroni and cheese. And so we have to be prepared for how those things are going to work out. But those are going to be the winners and losers, Mark. And it's a great question. And instead of applying names, I'd rather kind of give you the buckets of where they fall.
Sure, we appreciate that. Well, I want to thank each of my panelists for joining us here today, and all of our viewers for coming to the Insolvency Practice Group. And for anybody who's interested, the photo behind me is from the Super Bowl, and I'm going to end this with a Go Chiefs. Thank you.